I was thinking as I came over that I should title my talk The Age of Apps. And the reason is people are obsessed with apps. And we have all these huge phenomena and all of these sort of bubbles and so forth and so on and funding and so forth. And I decided to study the app situation. And by the way, I've now renamed the title to be The Search for Answers. But here are the apps that I thought were most interesting. These are emergent, and they're just about to take off. Yo. It was launched last year. And they raised $10 million, and its entire function was to send yo to your friends. Y-O. Drunk dial no. It blocks ill-advised outgoing phone calls based on preset user preferences. Very useful. Fatify. I personally use this one. It allows you to take pictures of your friends and make them look fat. Haircaster. Very useful in Britain. It provides forecasts for hair conditions depending on weather like humidity, wind, and rain. Users get useful tips like Frizz Alert. Very, very useful app. I don't use this, but some of you may. Am I going down? Uses international flight data to calculate the odds of one's plane crashing. A sample answer is, you'd expect to go down if you took this flight every day for 21,345 days. Excuse me, years. Sit or Squat, a database of thousands of restrooms all over the world. Helps users find the nearest bathroom. Very useful. Swearport teaches users to swear in the language of the country they're visiting. Users choose the word phrase they want and select from 45 languages to translate. It provides audio pronunciation and gives each word an intensity rating. This is the world that we have built. The more serious answer, having now analyzed the question of whether apps are taking over the world, is to talk a little bit about how the world moves forward. And what I believe is sort of Google is on the sort of search for better answers. And certainly what I've participated, along with many of the people here in the room, for more than a decade. In contrast to some of the earlier comments this morning, I'm going to start with the premise that we're living in an extraordinarily exciting time to be alive. That the average life expectancy is 71.5 years. Poverty rates have been half. The progress that is due to improvements that we're going to see in the next science, medicine, technology, and I'll talk about this, are going to be profound. And part of the process here is you have to understand how human progress occurs. And it occurs because people state a hard problem, and they find the answer, they implement it, and they move on, and they build layer and layer. And Google's organization, Google is organized, sort of the heart of Google can be understood as asking these hard questions, internal dissent, tough issues, and then looking for that. So search started that way with Larry and Sergey. At the time, people forget, the search solutions were not very good. And so the Google search algorithm called PageRank was a completely whole cloth way of organizing information and doing mathematical ranking that was different. It had not been invented before. That's the beginning, that's the genesis, if you will, of the corporation that's your sponsor today. And so if you start from a first principles position rather than established wisdom, you have an opportunity to actually change something. Most of the things that I've done have been evolutionary. But every once in a while, a revolution is possible, and it always starts with that as its point, with its basic principle. So we're sitting here, and one of the gentlemen here in the front row is sitting there, and he's thinking about the following problem. It's the 2000 Grammy Awards, and Jennifer Lopez, who I must convince I didn't know who was at the time, was wearing a beautiful green dress that was causing an awful lot of excitement. People would search for this dress, they couldn't find it. He and a couple of others said, we need to have image search. Image search today is billions and billions and billions of users every day. What was interesting was it was sponsored by a problem, and then they thought through how to do that. Same thing with translation. The web was all in English. We all understand that the world is not all English. In fact, the #1 language is Chinese. We invented something called Google Translate. We do more than 1 billion free translations a day, all using various forms of machine learning, which I can describe. We did the same thing with maps. It started with people who were searching for the Champs-Élysées, and they wanted a map to it, and all of a sudden, boom, now we could show a map, and the rest took over. Now maps are profoundly useful for billions every day. Think about cheap flights to Paris, cheap flights to everywhere, which is sort of the canonical query, but there's no good way to answer that, so we ultimately built something called Flight Search for the same reason. Mobile has a new set of problems, ignoring the apps that I quoted as a joke. And it's turned out it's hard to type on phones. And so we built Google Voice Search so that you can talk to your phone can talk back. Actually makes a difference. And so we're not done. An example would be, show me flights under $500 for places when it's hot in December and I can snorkel. Perfectly reasonable query. And people do that all the time. And it turns out Google has all of that information, but not all in one place. And indeed, we're working hard to solve that problem. When we can solve that problem, we can begin to answer these sort of compound questions and really get you to snorkeling quicker, or whatever the analogous point is. So if you think of that as sort of a starting point, the next issue is information everywhere. And there, the sort of observation is that mobility is everything. And developing apps for mobile phones is very difficult for all the reasons people know. You need a common API, but the telcos and all the phone vendors are not unified. So a team at Google basically said, look, is there some solution that might actually work? Let's build an open source piece of software, and let's go ahead and make this thing work for all the different vendors' phones and see if we can have a common API, which we do because we have a common app store, and have all those apps run on all these different phones. That, of course, is Android. Android is now the vast majority of the telephone market for smartphones. Now, why does this matter? Smartphones, there's on the order of 2.5 billion smartphones, depending on how you count, and it's the fastest growing category in the world. It's growing somewhere between twice to 4 times faster than PCs at the equivalent point. So this phenomena became a global and a pervasive phenomena in 5 years, right? That's when you get it right. That's the kind of impact that you can have. But the key thing there was that you had to unify the telcos and unify the phone manufacturers, because otherwise they were all going in disparate ways. By giving it away, making it free, it worked. So what's interesting is we did the same thing with Google Play. So then you sit there and you say, okay, well, I have this device, but I can't do connectivity. I use the term one broadband for this. So this conversation about the next 5 billion, and I wrote a book about this, and so forth and so on. And then the obvious things are do 3G networks and so forth. That takes too long. So one of the engineers said, why don't we use balloons? And I must tell you that I was absolutely convinced that this was the craziest, stupidest, and most unlikely to ever succeed idea that Google has ever had. And in confounding my judgment as usual, it works very well. And what happens is you put this balloon up there, and it actually uses altitude to control its direction, because the winds differ. And that was the key insight. How do they know that? I don't know. They're physicists. They're very smart. Somehow they figured this out. Right? It was actually an idea that no one thought would ever work, and indeed is beginning to work in the southern hemisphere. Now, how much impact will that have? It's hard to say. But the people it will reach will be people who will never be reached by any of the other technologies in the next 10 to 20 years. It's truly a free good. It's truly, in terms of access, it's free in the sense that we have no idea what the potential of those people are, and we certainly hope it's going to be phenomenal. The interesting thing is that if you sort of do everything right, then the revenue follows. So the key principle in businesses is get this kind of stuff right, and then you can find ways to sell it and monetize it and so forth. In our case, largely from advertising. And part of it is because our markets are also consumer markets. And so we end up in a situation where the poorest person gets exactly the same quality of service and answers as the prime minister or the richest person in the country and so forth. And that's a sort of defining characteristic of what we're trying to do. So I was trying to think about what are the sort of bets that are the sort of next generation of bets. Because you sit there and you go, okay, well, that's a pretty good list, right? We did search, maps, so forth and so on, and then we're doing this sort of loon thing, which actually worked, much to my frustration. Congratulations to the team. Well, we had another idea, and that other idea had to do with investing in areas that matter to a lot of people. So we changed the way we think to say we're not just going to do web information search mobile stuff. We're going to do stuff that affects a lot of people. So somebody had the bright idea of having a contact lens that had the world's smallest battery in it, and the contact lens has a full computer that Wi-Fi's out what's going on in your eye. Okay, interesting. Now, what goes on in your eye turns out to be really, really interesting, because it's the one place where you can really watch what's going on in your body. And indeed, we, in roughly 6 months, invented a contact lens that will give you your glucose state. Everybody knows, all the Americans here know that diabetes is going to be the #1 killer in America, and I suspect that Europe will follow. Your food is better, but eventually, you'll succumb to the temptation. And so this is like a global problem, or certainly a developed world's problem, where the U.S. is leading, unfortunately. It's a huge market. So because we're not in the medical device business, we license it to a big medical device manufacturer, and off we go. So then the next question was, and this is done in a group called Google X, what affects all of us? Well, we all drive. So the numbers on driving, as much as all of us like to drive, and I certainly like to drive, 1.2 million people are killed in traffic jams, traffic accidents every year. That's roughly a 737 crashing every week. Do the math. 83% of these crashes, these are deaths, are caused by human error, right? And so it sort of makes sense, right? Computers should be able, with the proper eye, to be able to see better. People thought this was crazy. So we invented this iris eye, which is very, very expensive, by the way. It uses a laser to start with. But of course, the price will come down. And it sees better than your eye, right? Because the computer can actually run faster. And then you train it using training algorithms and machine learning, and all of a sudden, I've been in this thing, and it actually works. And after you initially calm down and you let the car drive, everything works just fine, right? Of course, there's a kill button in case you get worried about software bugs or something like that. But what's interesting is you start thinking about it. I'm absolutely convinced that 100 years from now, people will laugh. Because it's so obvious that a computer should drive you. It's just so obvious from a reliability. Think about the drunk problem alone, ignoring my drunk dial app problem. I'm absolutely convinced that 100 years from now, people will see movies, old movies, which will have some handsome actor get in the car and drive, and they'll giggle. Because they think, why would you take the handsome actor and let them drive, right? Makes no sense to them, because cars will drive you. Maybe they'll keep some old, cars that you have to drive around just as sort of a demo. So the underlying bets here are very, very interesting. What does this emerging computing platform look like? Android or iOS, the battle between Android and Apple is the defining battle of the computation age. It's where all of the money is going on. All the apps that I described earlier in my joke comments were all available on both platforms, thank goodness. And I was sitting there thinking about how powerful is my smartphone? It's on the order of 1 billion times faster than the mainframe I used when I entered this industry, right? And it's obviously an awful lot cheaper. Very fast networks. We now have, and Google is one of the leaders here, gigabit fiber. I don't understand why we don't just have that. It seems quite obviously useful. Fiber has enormous amounts of bandwidth inside of it. People have demonstrated LTE, which is the predominant 4G standard, at the 100 megabit range. Wi-Fi standards are now going well above 100 megabits. I have a router in my home that does 150 megabits, and I've measured it right at the Wi-Fi level. So this world where bandwidth is available all the time, everywhere, is upon us, and that will change the way we build our apps. Google scale computing in the back end, and I'll talk a little bit more about this machine learning aspects. But not only do you have a supercomputer in your pocket, and you have this incredibly fast sort of one broadband model, but you also have a sort of supercomputer on the back end, which does all the calculation. So when you do a search or you do translate or whatever, your phone packages it up and ships it to the supercomputers, which are sitting in the cloud somewhere. They do the work, and it comes back to you. You think the phone did it, but it's really the phone plus the network, right? It's easy to understand. If you turn the network off, you'll see how much less useful your phone is. And the web is not dead, but the web apps have taken all of our attention. And we are going to move more from a search model to more of a suggest model. We're going to suggest things to you. We're trying to be helpful. So the UIs and all the apps that we're talking about move to being more and more and more helpful to each and every one of us. How will you experience this? Well, I still remember when Google Maps first came out, I decided to traverse Mount Everest. I'm highly unlikely to ever go up to the top of Mount Everest, me personally. All of you, fine, I'm highly unlikely. So I went to the very top, and I did the entire route by Google Earth. And I was very proud of myself. And I did it from the safety of my office in California. One of the wow moments is the day you remember how much you now depend on your phone, which is the day you lose it, right? Another one is the day that when you put your whole genome in the cloud, and then you realize that researchers are going to start using your genetics with your permission, right, to help other people with these extraordinarily difficult diseases that people get. Another day will be the day you realize when the computer or the airbag or whatever of the car saved you, that you would be dead if it weren't for automation. Another day where you're going to go, oh my God, it's going to be one of those aha moments, is when you see a 3D image of your grandchild, right, rather than just a static picture. But for me, last week, I met a blind man who could now see because he had a retinal implant, and he told me, I can see with my eyes closed. That's what did it. Right? It's extraordinary. So the underlying technological things going on here have to do with machine learning, and Andrew mentioned this a little bit. What machine learning is a series of what are called neural networks, and they're layered. And you take these layers and you classify at various levels what you see. And these algorithms work by taking a very large amount of data and producing new algorithms, essentially. And they get better with more training data. And this works for lots of business things that you see, but it doesn't work for things which have very narrow or specialized data or very infrequent data. So for example, I'll give you a simple example. It works well for consumer fashion, but not very well for luxury fashion, because there's so much more consumer data than there is luxury data. So easy to understand that the way this technology will appear in our lives in things where there's lots and lots of data set. I mentioned driving a car. There's lots of data driving a car because lots of things going on all the time. Plus, we've driven our cars, 500,000 miles or whatever the number is. And every time you drive, the algorithm just gets a little bit better. So there's all sorts of questions that you could ask. Which stores should have my inventory? Where will the traffic be? A possible future could be suggest what I should do today. I mentioned we're trying to move to suggest. Maybe we'll be able to do that. Send me a summary of something. Make me smarter on a subject I know very little about. Educate me. Right? That's the kind of thing that these things can do. So there's lots and lots of implication of this sort of new set of platform things that are happening. I decided I would call these the sort of big four. And this is really a message to the policymakers in the audience. I think you got to fix four things. You got to fix education, right? Especially technical and entrepreneurial education. You got to fix immigration, allowing people going back and forth. I know this is counter to the protectionism that we're seeing now. You have to invest in entrepreneurships in all forms, because entrepreneurs create the companies that create the jobs, right? That's how you solve the problems that are in front of us. And of course, you need lots and lots of investment in the internet in one form or another. From my perspective, the best is internet competition and private sector investment. But this infrastructure that I'm describing is the pathway to knowledge in this generation. This is in the same sense that when I was a boy and my grandfather said that he went to college, my father went to graduate school, and I had to go to a PhD school because the pathway to knowledge required all those steps. Right? We forget, by the way, that in America, 100 years ago, 10% of the people were illiterate. Right? I don't need to remind Europeans of the history 100 years ago of Europe. Right? The fact of the matter is society has moved forward very much because of these pathways to knowledge. That's why we have universities. That's why we have all the things that all of us went to. So in our case, I think, and speaking to Europe in general, Europe needs to spend more money, for example, on its research universities that are well documented that they're underfunded relative to the others. The European digital market is a great idea, but needs to be more open, those sorts of things. Now, I ask questions myself when I do this analysis, and I say, will virality and machine learning coexist? Right? You talk to a venture capitalist, all they care about is an app and virality, right? But the real story will be when machine learning interacts with that, and the machine and the apps just get smarter and smarter. What do we do when Moore's law slows? Moore's law is slowing for various technical reasons, which I could describe. And the fact of the matter is we should be sensitive to our computer friends. They're slowing down. They're having more trouble, right? They're getting older, whatever metaphor. And there are solutions to that, but it's more difficult. Where are the real breakthroughs in security and all the issues that everybody here knows about, all the issues about security and privacy? How do we make sure that these systems are resilient? How do we make sure that they stay up? How do we deal with all those issues? How do jobs change? Again, Andrew wrote a great book on this question. Dambisas talked about it as well. But how does our politics change, right? Because the media have changed so much. Another questioner asked about that. Now, I'm convinced, by the way, that the world will organize itself with people and computers, people doing what we do really well, which is creativity, asking questions, so forth and so on. And computers have infinitely perfectly memories, and they're highly predictable, right? And I think that's ultimately where we're going to go. So let me finish and take a couple of questions by saying, look, search is what we started with, but what we really want to do here, and why I came all the way here to talk to you guys about, is we care about asking the really hard questions. We start from first principles. It's easy to understand. You start from first principles. You try to get that key technical insight. If you don't have a good technical insight, you sit there and you say, where is the insight? Where is the insight? Where is the insight? And you keep pushing until you do. You don't do something which is just sort of derivative. And you have to have a healthy disregard for the impossible to pull this stuff off. And this process is this iterative process of invention that has characterized humanity for many, many decades. Many companies are doing this, not just Google. Now, I'm convinced that we're just on the cusp of major, major progress in biology, the brain, transportation, energy, and computer use. I'm absolutely convinced, for example, that we can change education because now we can finally measure it. And using machine learning algorithms and testing and so forth and so on, we can do far, far better. I'm also convinced that each and one of us will live much, much longer as a result. Longer and healthier lives, sort of one of the sort of prime directives for each one of us. That we'll see great strides in climate change, in addressing it in our lifetime, that the seeds for the technological solutions to address some of these major issues are really before us. But the most overwhelmingly good message is not the one about us, but it's about the next 2 billion people who will be lifted out of stifling poverty in the next 30 years. And that's the greatest message of all. So I'm very much an optimist about this. Thank you very much.